Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, on this beautiful Saturday. Today, we just want to talk about slavery in the South rather quickly in this period of the Revolution of 1800 to early 1840s. It is totally different than the North, which the North is becoming industrialized with the first industrialization, the market revolution. It's becoming connected with the infrastructure, roads, canals, railroads. The South won't, and that is a key difference. As the North develops, as we get Western movement, we will also get that in the South, but it's for different reasons. And really specifically, it revolves around this idea of King Cotton. In the South at this time, and we need to understand the Upper South was the early colonies, and Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina were known for tobacco, although tobacco was a very unstable crop. It destroyed the land. As you move south into South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, you got rice. However, that took extensive irrigation, took 9 months to grow. You also have sugar, which had a huge labor expense, took a long time to grow. And then you had long staple cotton, which also took a long time to grow. And so, as these crops, there comes this option of short staple cotton, which the hardest thing about it was getting the seeds out of it. However, Eli Whitney's cotton gin will change this, and it will increase the production of cotton rapidly and in a huge amount, and also it's because of the demand. Remember, Britain's industrializing, their textile industries will go first, so that will increase the demand. And then we have New England factories in the 1840s, 1850s that will increase that demand. So cotton becomes the thing, and it will move from the upper South to the lower South, or what will become known as the deep South. And so these are great pictures. Some of the ramifications of this is that slavery will increase, okay, and also move more into that deep South, as you can see from these two maps to my right here. This is called the Second Middle Passage, this movement. Now remember, the foreign slave trade or international slave trade was banned in 1808. That was in the Constitution. But you can see this move. Along with this move, and as you can see, we're going west. Remember the Missouri Compromise, which is that first initial Band-Aid, doesn't allow for slavery to go above the 3630 line. And so this is what's going to happen as we move south, as people move south to make a profit on cotton. They're going to need more land, which at this time was controlled by Spain. One reason we're going to get the Mexican-American War. Now, life, because of King Cotton, was based on farming. And most of those who had money were on plantations, and so the need for industry wasn't there. They didn't have a whole lot of extra money. Their money was in their slaves and their land, so the development of manufacturing wasn't key. Cities weren't big because most people lived on farms. Either you were a large farm owner or a small one, a yeoman farmer as they call, but most people didn't live in cities. So the South will have little infrastructure, they'll have little manufacturing. It will be a totally different world. The people will not be starting to condense into cities. You also don't have the immigration that the North has, okay, because most of their labor was done by slaves. However, in saying that, we must understand that Southern white society, we put a big emphasis on owning slaves, but only about 380,000 people out of 8 million white people in the South at this time actually owned slaves. So it is not a huge amount. And so with that, there is the idea that Much was controlled by this planter aristocracy, those plantation owners. Much of their money was tied up in their slaves in the land. And maybe this holds true in the Upper South, those old colonial states like Virginia, North, South Carolina. But really in the Deep South, many people had not lived there very long. It wasn't that established. And so that can be inaccurate at times. But we do need to understand that not everyone owned slaves. Women in the South, you get this thing in the North called the cult of domesticity, which basically women were to be home, they were to teach and raise their children, educate the young, and raise them in religious virtue. You kind of get the same thing in the South, but it's called this kind of the cult of honor, that men were there to protect, which means women were obliged to obey. Now they lived farther away from towns. They lived on their farms. Usually, those who weren't on plantations worked on the farms in some way. Those who were on plantations were more, we'd call them trophy wives now. But that was kind of where we were at. Most white men, though, were yeoman farmers or hill people. Hill people will be interesting because these are like the Ozarks people or the Appalachian Mountains. They're subsistence farmers, meaning they are providing enough for themselves, maybe a little bit extra, but they relied on this plantation lifestyle. They would sell to plantations owner. They would use certain equipment that they didn't have. They probably were leasing their land from plantation owners. They might borrow slaves during harvest from plantation owners. There's just a lot of things that they relied on from plantations. However, there is a common theme, whether you were the richest of the plantation owners or the poorest, is that the black slaves were inferior. There was that idea throughout the South, no matter where you at. So the Southern society, this white culture in the South, or just Southern culture, was based on plantations, lacked industry and infrastructure. Cities weren't developed. Okay, it was all based on this idea of King Cotton. Now, what did this do for slaves? This was called the peculiar institution. This institution that, not necessarily right or morally right, but needed. Okay, and it really was established with the slave code. Slaves could not meet in groups; they couldn't go out at night. Whites could not educate slaves, teach them to write or read. If a slave, if a white man killed a slave, usually not tried for. What do I want to say? Not tried for. Okay, so when we talk about slavery, this peculiar institution, not necessarily morally right, but economically needed, you get it established on these idea of slave codes. This will not allow blacks to congregate in groups, not allow them to go out at night, not allow them to be educated, to read or write. A slave who is killed by a white man, that white man is usually not tried for murder. On the other hand, a black man could be or would be killed if he did the same thing. And so we get this. We get the domestic slave trade. And you can see I misspelled it right there, but the domestic slave trade, remember in 1808, the foreign slave trade was banned. Domestic slave trade is brutal. It will split families. It is basically our way to get a labor force from the Upper South to the Lower South or the Deep South. Now, life on slaves is hard, for slaves is hard. All those things, those characteristics we've heard are accurate. You have those who work in the field, those who work at homes. Some are basically contracted out to work in industries where there's not a labor force like the North, where there's immigrants. And so you get some resistance, and this is key to understand. You get Denmark Vesey, who had a group of 9,000 who was going to resist. Their plan was spoiled early, maybe the most famous, and you can watch The Birth of a Nation, which is based on that. Nate Turner's rebellion, where he was able to escape with slaves and get or kill about 60 white men, women, and children before he was captured, and about 100 will be executed. An interesting other movie you might want to watch is Amistad. It's about a ship that was taken over by Cuban African slaves that were going to head back to Africa, although it was captured by the United States Revenue Service, and they went to court. Basically, should we send them back to Cuba or should we send them to Africa? Interesting enough, John Quincy Adams is the defendant for them, played by Anthony Hopkins. He is an abolitionist, and so he's going to fight that they should be freed and sent to Africa. So that would be a great movie to watch if you want to watch one of these two movies. All right, I'm over my time. Have a wonderful weekend. See you next week.